you're a musician. Is that true?
Yeah, I play guitar. I have a little jazz quintet.
Yeah, and I really like this idea of like analogical reasoning and how people can kind of draw on their roles and their lives and that kind of stuff to then create meaning. And it's so cool the way you just bring the ideas of music into philosophy. It's very hard to do, I think. And yeah, it's awesome. I really like.
Well,
I said before I just started recording. It's such a work of art. I think that it expands my horizons, and it's very grounded in the real. It's not like some fantasy that's expanding my
yeah, well,
horizon.
thanks for saying so. I mean, I'm glad you have that reaction. I mean, I agree with you about analogy. I think analogy is pretty much the key to rationality, and so I think it's always powerful to find things in your life and ask sort of how is this a lens for other things? You
Yeah.
know, how can this significance be something I can use to make sense of other things? I think that's the most powerful thing we can do.
Yeah, it's really cool because when you give yourself to something like music or a hobby or a passion, especially in such a work-oriented society,
Mm-hmm.
you really grow in this very unique way, and you experience. John Vervaeke calls it like perspectival knowing and participatory knowing, and it's cool that like there is such a thing as a cobbler that knows shoemaking in an intimate, like erotic way, and not like a
Yeah,
sexual way, but in a very
in a
erotic,
passionate way.
yeah, in a passionate way. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. I think
that,
that's a. I mean, that's a sort of a. It's not exactly a lost thing in our world, but it's a diminished thing. You know, we don't live in a world
right.
of craft so much anymore. People are good at typing on their keyboards, and flipping the switches or doing things on their cell phones, but that's not the same as someone who can make shoes or someone who tills the soil or knows how to handle a horse. And it seems like we really lost a lot of that in our culture. That developing of these rich kinds of engagement with the world, where it's not like an alien piece of work you have to do. It just becomes your life's passion to engage with that thing, and that's it contributes so much to our own growth and development. But then also it does provide this kind of really rich aperture for making sense of other things.
Yeah, it's an aperture, it's a lens. It's like the way Plato describes vision as like, the light is something which calls seeing into being,
Right.
and then it kind of participates perpetually in being even after you've become a thing with eyes. It's really kind of weird the way reality does that, the way we're in this kind of participatory, co-creative, not in the sense that we're like deities above it blasting our wishes into life, but like really there's this intimacy in who we are and our environment and what we do. It's kind of, it's easy to get lost on what do they say, like in culture you don't see the water you're swimming in when you're a fish, kind of.
Yeah,
It's like that
absolutely.
kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just thinking about what you were saying about the light and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I love
think
Plato.
yeah, I think it's a really basic thing to recognize that the the world in a way kind of calls things up out of us. It's kind of summons things out of us. And we often don't notice that relationship to the world. One place where we do, I think, sometimes is around other people. Sometimes another person has this sort of magnetic force, not just because you think they look nice, but something about their spirit or their character. Some speaks to you, but what it can do is it can actually draw things out of you. You think or behave or speak in a way you otherwise wouldn't. It would never occur to you to do. And that way that people, I think that we can recognize that thing that people can do to us. And I think that's kind of a model for the world in general. If you let it, the horse or the shoes you're trying to make or the ground you're trying to till or whatever, like those things can do that too. They can summon out of us possibilities for connection and growth that are very, very powerful.
Yeah, I like the idea of being called to something, because it's not quite a plan. A
Yeah.
plan is like, I need this thing, and if I don't solve it, I'm going to have trouble, and that trouble is going to be a burden or something. But then there's something, like you said, when you're in a room with someone, maybe you've never met them, maybe it's like someone you've known a long time, and all of a sudden maybe they see you some way, or you see them seeing the world some way, or they carry themselves in some way. And all of a sudden, I don't know if you know Ellen Scarry's work on beauty.
No, no, I know the work on pain. I don't know the work on beauty.
Yeah, well, she talks about like something like a tree. When you see something as beautiful, that it strikes you in such a way that it makes all other trees be reconsidered almost. And it's like the categories you're living through, all of a sudden they become malleable again. And it's not like artificial. It's because you were really struck by
Yeah.
this thing that we're talking about. And it's a different way of thinking about beauty and decision making and character than using the word is a lot and describing a lot of
Yeah,
properties,
yeah, yeah.
and like very like a systems view of biology or something like that.
Yep.
Um,
No, I think that's right. I think that's an excellent point about beauty in particular.
yeah, because the way you talk about epiphany is you're struck by them. You're
Mhm.
really they come into being as a whole thing. It's not like, oh, I really want to write a good 10 paragraph paper, and over a couple of weekends I kind of build it with my thoughts. Um, and there's just I think when someone starts to appreciate the world that way and can really kind of buy in or see the philosophy that you're talking about, it's it invites you into a more lived experience in some weird way. It really, when
Mhm.
you teach this to students, do you find some percent of them really start acting differently or get more excited
I mean,
and stuff?
I've never taught, or actually, I shouldn't say never. I have very rarely taught my own books, but these ideas certainly come out. For example, when I teach Plato, or various things in existentialism, various other philosophical traditions. Uh, yeah, these ideas do come out, and I think it is very much the case that people, um, not all students, but many students experience a kind of connection through those ideas, and they sometimes they sort of feel like, oh, this is something I've been waiting to hear. It's almost like
Yeah,
they're what they were looking for, and it really people really do open up. I mean, they feel they feel touched, in a meaningful
yeah.
way, but it really does bring out of them new kind of energy and creativity. So yeah, I think these ideas are extremely powerful.
Yeah, that's really cool. And what drew you to this kind of thinking? Were you always this kind of person? Because I think of philosophers, there's self-selection involved in the kind of philosopher you become and the kind of writer you become, and that if I really resonate with Heidegger, I'm way likely not to resonate with certain other philosophers. And like, was this a lot like you, or how did this come into
It's a
being?
good question. Let me just think about that for a second. uh I guess when I was young, when I was a kid, um there were two things that really did animate me, uh, and that are related to this. One is that I was very focused on the idea of interpersonal recognition, and the idea that we really depend on the kind of feedback about ourselves that we get from other people. And so ever since I was small, mostly because of the influence of my father, who used to talk about those things.
Oh, cool.
I've always been very focused on that idea that our our sense of self-esteem and our ultimate sense of identity are really wrapped up in the kind of dynamics of interpersonal exchange. So that's one idea that was always on my mind. And then also, I had a sister who was herself very interested in art, and she always encouraged me when I was a little kid to draw or to make stories or whatever. And so I always did that. And so I think that issue of the dynamics of interpersonal recognition and the issue of just sort of creative expression were always part of my life. And so those are at the heart of this book, Bearing Witness to Epiphany. And so I think in a way it's true that that's, in that sense, I've always been that kind of person. And I do think that as I went on to study, like, I've also always been very technically minded. And so, studying the history of philosophy, studying the discipline of philosophy, uh, I've been very engaged with, precise argumentation and debates about this and that, uh, stuff that might in some ways seem more dry or analytical. But I'm very wrapped up in those things too. But nonetheless, it's true that the route I ended up making through the discipline did end up bringing me to the people who focus on the dynamics of interpersonal recognition and these issues of creativity, like Plato or Hegel, especially for the stuff about recognition, or the theme of art, Plato, or art and beauty, again, Plato, or Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty. So yeah, I think those philosophical traditions are kind of where I was destined to go already because of my interests.
Yeah, I look at people very broadly. I want to say this carefully, but like there's kind of different types of people and little recipes that feed into people. And when people have really healthy interpersonal lives, like family lives and stuff, community lives, no scarring trauma, and then they have exposure to art and creativity, which is separate from those two things, and then a love of thinking, this third thing. It's a really cool blend because a lot of
Yeah.
people do at least one of those three really well, and that makes them like really cool to learn from and to witness and stuff like that. But when it's all three, there's this very human thing that happens, and it sometimes stays very human because of all the threads being
Yeah.
together. And especially chapter 4 and 5, to keep the book
Mm-hmm.
involved in this a lot, it's really like ties in why all your arguments make sense is because we're a species that was birthed by parents who kind of lived through this process,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow they came together interpersonally, and now we're like at the mercy of life at first and
Yeah.
dependent, and then we need to actually become a person, become an I, and become a we. And then when that happens, it actually transcends that being into new beings, and then you have children and a community and teachers and things like that. And this kind of cycle of humanity can really keep going. And we are such a different species because of our culture and because of
Mm-hmm.
that process of language and talking and dreaming together and seeing each other outside of our first person experience. And yeah, it's really, really cool the way you bring that in at the end, because I feel like if that's at the beginning and someone started saying, here's what he believes, he really thinks life is all about family and kids, and that's what makes philosophy real, you could kind of throw away the beauty of your arguments before you think about them deep and appreciate them a little bit. But because you start to buy into like, and I 100%, I think wonder can change someone's life. Just starting to learn what wonder is a kind of profound aporia that can really transform people. And so, yeah, I just thought it was really cool the way you start with wonder and this kind of uh, co-creative, allopoetic, autopoetic description of what we are and who we are and things, and then tie it into, oh yeah, we're embodied beings born from families. We're like, all of these layers of who we are makes a lot of sense from the very abstract
Yep.
points of view that you start from.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing you're talking about there is very much at the heart of what was on my mind when I was writing the book. I think about families a lot, and it's unavoidable that the people we become will be, in a way, drawing on those resources that came from our family life. And we're essentially, you said we're at the mercy of the world, we're at the mercy of our families, right? We're essentially dependent upon those people who surround us and take care of us, well or poorly, when we're
Right.
little kids. Like, that's what's going to determine how we're able to sort of take up ourselves and take up the world and become someone. And so that the dynamics of family life have always, again, really interested me. But it has a lot to do with that issue of interpersonal recognition, and
Yeah.
thinking about how much the ability of a child to develop a healthy sense of self-esteem and self-trust really depends on what kind of feedback they get from their parents. And so parents, and parents and surrounding people,
Yeah,
those
yeah,
people have tremendous power to do something really helpful and to produce a
yeah.
rich supportive environment where we can grow. And then of course the other side is also true too, right? If people handle that relationship very poorly, the little child is put in a crippling position where the
Right.
thing you absolutely depend on isn't supporting you, and it's, if anything, stunting you. And so that's really I wrote a book before this, before bearing witness to Epiphany, called Human Experience. It was more focused on that side. It was more focused on the problems that can come from family life because of this, right? In the way we can develop psychological problems because of that environment. And then in this book, Bearing Witness to Epiphany, I was more interested in what are the resources we have for growth and development, the sort of erotic impulse and creativity and so on. And so I think that I really do think that it is in our relations with other people that we have the most power to grow, and the most power to develop. And but I just think that's such a charged, and for that reason kind of ambivalent domain, because it's both the site for our greatest fulfillment and greatest development, but it's also a site of great vulnerability, and
Hmm.
rough things can happen to people there too. And so that's really, I think, what for many years, I think that's what I've really focused on. How the the, the people that we become, the persons we become, are so much embedded in those dynamics of sort of power struggle and recognition or whatever in
Hmm.
intimate interpersonal life.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that's such a it's a theoretically interesting topic, but personally, I think for anybody, that's
Oh,
the thing
yeah.
that we really need to work on. We need to look at that and figure out, like, what's going on in these relationships and how did I become who I am and so on. I think that's such a
Yeah.
powerful issue.
Yeah, I love that. I've done a lot of Jungian therapy, and I study psychology and have a master's in organizational science and psychology. And in the therapeutic process, I don't think this is too personal, but it is a little personal. One of the first things as a Jungian, as like they do, it's parts work and things like that. And there's like these layers to our personality, and those early attachments and early instances of our personality are really deeply formed early in life. And a lot of like our first kind of archetypal images that appear in our dreams are parent figures, literal
Right.
parents, not archetypal, weird kings, but our mom or our
Yeah,
dad
yeah.
or our uncle and stuff like that. And yeah, that's who we are. Is Also in therapy, in this strain of therapeutic thought, you internalize your parents and your family and your early community before you have a self, before you even
Right,
can
exactly.
internalize yourself, because a healthy adult has like an internalized self that they can draw on. Before you even are a self, there's this, you talk about in the book, like a child experiences the world as a semiotic dynamism, and a lot of the psychic or soulful energy that is kind of forming that initial ego or personality is that those relationships, how you're seen, how you see yourself being seen, and how, my mother comes from 7 brothers and sisters, and there's so much psychology being generated in that environment.
Yeah.
I'm an adopted only child, and my internal world was so from inside compared to that seen and being seen
Right.
thing. And I don't it's kind of beautiful. It's very chaotic compared to a very like here's what people are, how they're really formed and that kind of stuff. But it's yeah, and then the fact that like you're saying we can be aware of this and be kind of mindful of our roles in people's lives and in
Yeah.
our families' lives and in our weird what do they call them, like complexes that we
Right,
act
exactly.
out in our social families. um,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think that last one is a big one. Like, sometimes we do find out about ourselves that we have funny little hangups,
Oh,
and
lots. Yeah,
that's
right.
what it takes to start to take those things apart. Like, you have to ask, why did I develop that, and what is the model of interpersonal life I'm actually working from? And typically that goes back to that family.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you can go back and you can in a way go back and relearn how to be a person by exploring what has been lodged in you, and you
Yeah,
can sort of
yeah.
work to revise it.
Yeah, Pierre Grimes, the Platonist. I don't know if you know him well.
I don't know. No.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Philosophical Midwifery in the 70s, and he's part of
Oh, I know that title, yeah.
philosophical practitioners organizations and things like that. And he wrote about he called it the Pathologos, and he was a young guy, fresh out of World War II, found his first job, his first real job after the war, or something like that. And he was working with these alcoholics in his treatment center as a staffer or something, not as a psychologist or a
Mm-hmm.
therapist or a social worker or anything. But he talked to some people, and he realized that they were enacting these little like shining moments where they were seen and being seen, and like this fantasy was living out that they were fulfilling something in their mother's life or
Mm-hmm.
something. And he was actually able to, like, at least in his mind, jar them from that through their own kind of self-reflection and epiphany, and they would be freed from that pathologos a little bit. And some of them, he claims, would have dramatic changes in their relationships to alcohol
Yeah.
or trauma and stuff like that. So this idea that there's these little hidden way beneath our conscious thought, these pathologies that are acting out in our personality, um, and that, like, yeah, there's this rational processes we can have to even grow from that trauma, from trauma that happened before we were even conscious
Yep.
of
I
ourselves.
got
Yeah.
that actually sounds very interesting. I will check that out. That sounds like something that would fit well with a number of things I'm trying to talk about.
Yeah, I'll send you this and we can continue any of these conversations, because
Yeah.
I have a very small YouTube channel and I like to invite people that I think I really like their work. And so, yeah, if you ever want to talk about any of this stuff again, and I'll send you the resources I
Yeah,
mentioned.
please do.
Sure. Yeah. Um, cool. Is there more you want to say about, if like adults are listening to this and they're interested in applied philosophy and they're trying to reflect, oh, I think I can relate to what Dr. Russon is saying about family. Like, what else would you tell them to explore? Or
Um, well, I mean, well, say something about my own work. Like you're talking about the book bearing witness to epiphany, where I do kind of chart out that sort of model. But the more I get more into the sort of intimate details of how our personality is formed in those contexts in the my earlier book, Human Experience. So if
mhm,
people really are interested in pursuing that I would send them there.
that book's the
Or,
one.
pardon me?
That's the book. Is read the earlier one. I'm
Yeah, yeah,
aware of it. I never read it though, because yeah.
yeah. But so there's that one, and then I've written one since then called Adult Life, and that's one, people, if they're interested in these kinds of ideas and less focused on that idea of going back and exploring the formation of their own personality, but more interested in thinking about what it takes to live effectively as an adult. They might try
Yeah.
my book Adult Life, because those two, Human Experience and Adult Life, kind of, I don't know if I should call them practical or whatever, but they sort of flesh out in much more much more fully what it is to actually work with these ideas that are brought out in Bearing Witness to Epiphany. Whereas in Bearing Witness to Epiphany, I think there's lots of stuff in the book. I think what I was really trying to get at there is just focusing on that sort of power, the creative power in our life that comes from passion and the engagement with others and so on. So that's really trying to target that sort of driving energy in us.
Uh-huh.
But those other two, I think, work much more through the details of what goes on in making a personality and what goes on in living a life.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if people are interested, they can go to those.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I will definitely check that out as well. And yeah, I think just to tie it into Socrates too, I think that's something kind of unique about him, is when all of the philosophers were having these grand cosmological theories and theories about politics and all these other things, he was turning it towards us and
Yep,
towards this ethical
yep.
dimension that we could explore philosophically. And I feel like I've been changed by people like Pierre Hadot, who really calling us to think about life deeper, and like, what is a
Mhm.
spiritual practice, and what is aspiration. I don't know if you're familiar with Agnes Callard.
No.
She's a University of Chicago philosophy professor. She has this book called Aspiration, and she says aspiration is something that you can't do analytically, because it's like wishing to be a vampire. You can't know what a vampire is. This is another person's work, but I'm stealing the analogy for this argument. And it's like we don't know what it is to be different than ourselves, but rationally we want to be different than ourselves. And so how do we do that? We aspire. And
Uh-huh.
this whole idea of an aspirational universe that you paint. So you talk about rhythm and harmony and melody as these temporal dimensions to
Mhm.
our phenomenologically lived and experienced reality, and how things like language, you call it responsibility. I think of it as like attention. I think when your attention is on something, there's a responsibility involved, and how we're responsible to the insights that we
Yeah.
experience, um, to the non-solipsistic things that are behind our ideas, that when we encounter the world as things and objects and ideas, there's a moreness to them that is them. And like, what does it mean to encounter something and wonder in that encounter, and things like that. So maybe we could talk about these three ideas of rhythm, harmony, and
Sure.
melody. Could open them up a little bit.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I can say that the main thing that or the sort of core idea that I was trying to get at there in our lives, like if starting off with the musical example itself, like when you listen to a song, just an everyday song, you might sing the tune, and that's sort of what you notice. But behind it, there's a lot of other music being played, and it's people playing chords and things like that. But they play other notes, other chords behind the melody, and what that does is it provides a kind of meaningful atmosphere within which those notes of the melody make sense. And so you might not really notice that harmony so much. It just sounds, so it's kind of the background music, and yet that's really providing the context in which that nice little singable line you like sounds so rich and engaging. And then behind both of those things, there's some kind of pulse or uh, repetitive rhythm or something like that sort of like it sets you up and moving in a basic way. Like you might be swaying your body if you're dancing, or you might be snapping your fingers. Even if you're not doing something like that, you're almost certainly you're sort of feeling that rhythmic pulse in your listening. And so and so in music, those three things happen at the same time, and they when they come together, that's when you get powerful music. But they're discernible. They're different roles. They have a different function. And so I took that and said, I think this structure that you can recognize in music is actually at play in our lives all the time. And so whenever you're doing anything, there's something like a melodic line. When you're trying to get to work in the morning, you're following that sort of melodic line of, how am I going to get down the street, or how am I going to get on the bus, or whatever. Like you're tracing out a specific sort of path from A to B. Or when you're having a dinner conversation with your friend, like that's what you're wrapped up in. And again, you're trying to trace a path from wherever you are to some other place. So that's what I'm going to call the melody. But behind any of those things, there's a rich structure that's sort of presupposed, that is the context within which that thing makes sense. And a striking and unpleasant example is if you were going to work and suddenly people started bombing the city, or you went to war. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to go to work anymore. Like everything changed, and suddenly you got to do something new. But what that shows you is that there was a thing you were assuming that had to be that was there, and that had to be there for your melody to make sense. Like the water you said the fish was swimming in. There's a context that has to be there. You usually don't notice it, but that is there. And if someone takes it away, suddenly that specific activity you were involved in doesn't make sense anymore. And then, so one of the things that I then want to analyze in people's lives is that, like, what is the sort of harmonic structure in your life that's being assumed here such that this little storyline makes sense. And, in the case of a pathology, going back to the story about these old sort of family scripts that we've injected in our souls that shape everything, you may have grown up in a very antagonistic and oppositional environment. And it may well be that the kind of thing you're always assuming in your interactions is that you're fighting with people. You might not realize that. But so then in some particular interaction you have with someone, they really irritate you and you do this back to them and so on. And that's kind of the melody. And what you don't realize is that didn't have to happen. That's really happening because you've got this harmony in your life where you think everything is a fight, or something like that, right? So that's one of the projects of that book, is to sort of take the single fabric of our experience and show that it's got these different layers, and that there are deeper and deeper layers of harmony too, right? But that are these meaningful contexts. And then rhythm, I similarly want to say that rhythm helps us analyze one of the big meaning structures in our life too, because we get, when we do have meaningful structures, they tend to follow rhythms. Like a simple one is, you go to work during the day, you come home in the evening, and then you go to bed at night. And there's a daily rhythm you follow without even thinking about it. That becomes kind of the structuring form of your life. And it may well be that if you interrupt that, two things could happen. It could be that if you interrupt that rhythm, you kind of feel out of place and uncomfortable and you can't get stuff done. Like that can undermine you. Or sometimes if you interrupt the rhythm, you feel out of place, but it could be liberating. But either way, commonly, we really rely on certain rhythms to secure our sense of meaning. And there are many of them. It can be, that sort of obvious rhythm of like the work day, but it can also be something more like just the pace at which I move through my activities, or it could be how long I can go without seeing my partner or my friend before I start to get uptight. But there are all kinds of ways that we can be like together apart, or something like that. There are ways that are going to be comfortable and ways that aren't. So with all of these things, I'm looking at how the way our lives work for us depend on certain melodic structures, what I'm calling melodic structures, certain harmonic structures, and certain rhythmic structures. And when we're analyzing ourselves, trying to figure out what's going on with us, that's what we should be looking for. And we can discover, I'm especially interested in sort of pathologies because I'm kind of interested in how people can get past the things that are hanging them up, right? And so we can discover, like I'm committed to this kind of rhythm, or I've invested in this kind of harmony, and maybe I'd like to change that. But those are the things we typically don't notice. We typically just notice what I was calling the melody, without realizing how much we're actually hanging on to a certain kind of harmonic structure, a certain kind of context that we're bringing, or a certain dependency and a certain kind of rhythm that we're bringing. That's what lets us find certain melodies viable or not.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just think that's when we analyze our actions, we usually just stay at the melodic level. We say, I did this because blah blah blah,
Right.
And our sense of the becauses stay pretty superficial. And I guess what I'm trying to show is that usually the becauses are actually deeper. And
right.
You really want to understand what's going on here, you have to stop looking at the obvious sort of, so to speak, melodic terms you're paying attention to, and start asking, what's the harmony I'm responding to? What's the rhythm I'm responding to? And that, going back to Socrates, those things aren't usually just matters of neutral fact. To explore those actually means really investigating yourself and there's got to be some self-discovery and often some self-transformation to deal with those things well.
Well, that's why I love when you talk about art. Can you hear there's like tree work being done?
Oh
Can
no,
you
I
hear
didn't
that?
notice.
Oh, perfect. Zoom's editing it so that I won't mess with it. So it's really cool that art, because it's external, it gives us the capacity to be detached from our inner world.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's vivid, it gives us
Mm-hmm.
a chance to encounter our inner world. And so,
Yes.
because we're such fish in water, one of the things that's kind of good, I don't know if it's like truly good, but it's kind of good, is just to like blame someone, because when you blame someone, you just externalize something that was probably confused inside of you. And when it's out there, you can say, "Oh, I overreacted." That's saying something like you're saying about my harmony that I
Mm-hmm.
internalized, and I'm bringing this harmony into this discrete moment of time and space, and it's creating kind of secondary resonance that I'm not even aware of.
Yep.
And I don't know if you do any like work or personally practices on meditation or contemplation. I think music is kind of like contemplation anyways, and a
Yeah.
lot is, but anyways, it's it's cool that in a meditative sense as well, we can kind of build a relationship with ourselves and have these epiphanies and go, I had a friend do this one time. He said, I was so bad to my former self or my young self. And they, can see the complexes or the harmonies they were living out because they kind of got space from them and could be a bigger person,
Yep.
through their practices, and then starting to look at something that you're obsessed or struck by or upset by, and unfolding it the way you're talking about is like, okay, well, what were the harmonies at play? What were the relationships that weren't literally present, that were probably in the identities of the people, like the paradoxical identities of the people? And then how can I understand that? How can I make sense of that? How can I not let the negative part of that influence the relationships I claim to care about or my future relationship with myself?
Yep.
Um, and it's so sophisticated what you're saying.
No, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to just say something about meditation. Um, just a quick thing. I think that meditation can serve different purposes, but the way that it's initially powerful is that you are practicing kind of shutting down your immediate response to
Yeah,
situations, right? And that's kind of like getting away from the melody, to use my
yeah,
musical metaphor, right? Like,
yeah,
when you're listening to a melody of music, you're just sort of drawn along. It goes here, it goes here, it goes here, it goes here, and that's often kind of how we act. Something happens, and we just plug in the next thing that seems like it's supposed to be there, and our interaction with the world is often, I mean, it's too strong to say automatic, but it's something like that. Like it's almost sort of choreographed. Like if these things are going to happen, here's how I'm going to respond, and here's how I'm going to interpret them, and so on. So in our usual engagement with the world, we're kind of pulled along in this, as I was saying, in this kind of melodic flow, and meditation lets you step back and just kind of loosen those threads a bit. And so that's I think the the core of what's going on in meditation. Now that
yeah,
could be good for a lot of reasons. Like if you're if your life is stressful, if you're hung up about things, like just by itself, that can be very helpful because it can be calming, and it can let you retreat the same way that
right.
sleep lets you retreat from the day a bit. So what at one level, meditative practice is legitimately valuable for a lot of people
Mhm.
as a way to get a kind of restorative break from being just thrown along in all these things. So that's great, but I don't think that's the deepest thing. So I think
Okay.
there a further thing is that when you make that move back, you can then start to look at, and this connects with what we were
Yeah,
just talking about, you can actually start to look at, what was I doing? And so in Buddhism, they say that when the Buddhist monk breathes, he says, I am breathing. Like, it's just the idea that we become very attentive to what we're doing. I think that I think the powerful part of that is that we can start looking at the way we react to situations and ask, like, why do I get angry? What's that making me feel? Not just
Yeah.
because it would be interesting to have a catalog of those things, but because by noticing them, we get in the position where we can start to understand them.
Uh-huh.
So I think
Yeah,
that's
that's excellent.
the really strong thing. Like, I mean, that first thing about giving us a kind of relief, I think, is
Yeah.
very powerful.
Calmness feels really good, John.
Yeah, yeah,
Always.
yeah, yeah,
Calmness feels good. I have a very simple yoga practice we do, and when he's teaching beginner classes, the only thing he says that's psychological at all is calmness. We're doing calmness,
yeah,
and it feels good. If you ever just check your body after you've done something relaxing, you feel calmer, and it's emotionally feels pleasurable or something.
yeah. No, exactly. So I
But then
think
what
that's
you're
a
saying,
valuable, it's
yeah,
a
go ahead.
valuable life tool.
Hmm.
But there is this further thing you can do, which is build on that to
Right.
actually dig into kind of understanding what's happening in your experience. And that's when it can actually start to become transformative.
Yeah,
Then
because
it
not only
becomes,
are you calmer, but you're able to realize that there's variability in things you didn't think were
yes,
plastic, and starting
exactly,
to go,
exactly,
oh, I didn't have to be that way. I
exactly.
was in a state, and they were in a state, and that was more what caused what happened
Yeah,
than my intentions or myself or their intentions or their self. And yeah, there's something really powerful about having that capacity to take a psychological detachment from the immediacy of your personality of you.
yeah,
And yet that's what Socrates I think means by know thyself, right? It's like know that
exactly.
that's part of being a person. It's like holy crap, I am swept up in so many things, and they're not true. They're not I can maybe be curious about their authority and their power and stuff like that more than I was. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you just had mentioned
Cool.
meditation, and I wanted just to say that I think that's a powerful thing. It's not particularly something I talk about in that book. So it's a different route, but I think it's a route that you can take into these same issues. And
Yeah,
I think it's
yeah,
really
yeah. Because I'm
powerful.
interested in contemplative science. I mean, I look at your book again as like it was an object of contemplation for me and learning and
Mhm.
things like that. And um, we're not very good as a culture at talking about contemplation. I don't think we know what it is. I mean, I think in monasteries they know what it is, and people know what it's like to be in a forest on a walk and get lost in your
Yeah, yeah,
thoughts and have contemplative experiences. But what we were just talking about is like really like purposeful contemplation that used to
yeah,
be part of Socrates and Proclus and Iamblichus and all of these people's lives. Certainly Plotinus, he's one of the best
yeah,
contemplators in the tradition. And it's not woo, like you're saying. There's a way to contemplate the self, to be in a kind of contemplative mode that you can learn to do through practices or through your hobbies and things like that, that gives you access to, I don't know. In Zen, they call it moreness and suchness, and the moreness of things, and the unfold. You called it the double unfolding. If I'm
yeah.
not mis terming that.
In the
Um,
book, yeah, yeah.
mhm. Yeah. Do you see like contemplative practices being more useful in the next 100 years of Western history than they were in the last 100?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do think that our contemporary society is very technologically driven and very alienated, and um, so I do think it's probably true that as a culture we have produced people who are more alienated from the sources of meaningfulness in their lives than earlier cultures. And so I think probably that does mean things that allow us to um, transform that experience and connect back to the sources of meaning are in a certain way more important now than they have been before, because they're deficient. We need to fix something. And so in that way, yes, I guess it makes sense to me that a lot of people turn to contemplative practices. Generally they turn to them more for the first side, like it's trying to
Mhm.
get calm, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
great. Um, but that's it's good to do that, but that also in a way just kind of leaves things where they are. And but I think
Yeah.
if those things are taken a step further and we use them to start to transform our lives and transform
Uh-huh.
our culture, that's when they're going to be really valuable. But yeah, I think this is a good time for those things.
Yeah, it's interesting that art and ritual and spiritual practices or religious practices or philosophical practices um, afford that kind of knowing and relating to the world in ways that, like, using machines and offloading your needs and wants onto culture and just
Mm-hmm.
specializing and coordinating your specialized efforts into a kind of Heideggerian technological society that is almost like a membrane away from nature and the transcendent. And these, like you're saying, it alienates us from these kind of forms of meaning that our ancestors took for granted. They didn't even know they weren't possible, maybe, and now
Mm-hmm.
we know that they are quite not quite given as much as we thought or something. And yeah, it's really cool to think about, like you say in the book, like there's something ethical about being present to our own reality,
Mm-hmm.
and by being present to this maybe deeper level of meditation and taking that more seriously, someone that is maybe drawn to these practices for calm or community, maybe they're lonely a lot of
Yep.
times. Oh, cool, I got some people to talk to now. But then they get this Socratic third thing of introspective awareness and
Yep.
all of these capacities. And
Yep.
my friend he wrote or co-edited, I should say, the handbook, the Philosophy of Meditation handbook by Routledge last year. And it's interesting to even read people trying to articulate the value of what you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
of this process of looking beyond the rhythms of our personality into the harmonies that are causing our actions and maybe
Mm-hmm.
our suffering or are limiting our ability to thrive if we are not suffering. And
Yep.
oh, that's cool, John. I think it's much deeper, ironically, than a lot of philosophers go. When you just go to a bookstore and get a philosophy book, they give you a lot of cool new concepts to think about, but really getting into the depths of what it means to live or to I think the most philosophical question is kind of what is the good life
Yeah.
and how to do it, and that's really what you're talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when I think of philosophy, I really do think the issue is uh, uh, making sense of our own world, making sense of ourselves, and so on. And so I don't so much want to just be presenting cool new concepts as I don't want to do that so much as getting people to notice their experience and deepening their self-exploration. And so that's what I
Uh-huh.
try to do in all these books. I try to have some cool concepts too, I guess, but my goal is always to write in a way that a person can recognize what I'm talking about and say, oh yeah, I know that experience. Like they can find themselves in the book and ideally be drawn by the book or inspired by the book, uh, or drawn into um, noticing deeper and deeper things about themselves. I guess what I really want to say is I think philosophy is more about learning deeper things about yourself rather than learning sort of concepts out there in the world. And so I
Yeah,
don't I don't like philosophy books so much when they treat ideas as if they're just sort of facts to think about. I think
yeah, yeah,
philosophy matters when you find it's something kind of gripping you from the inside. And that's what I try to write.
yeah, because there's something really, I always think, personal about philosophy. That's not why I never get hung up on, like, is Nietzsche right or wrong. I think he was in a quest within his society, exploring his world, and did some things that I might find controversial or disagree with. But that's what we do. That's kind of what philosophy is asking those questions in a sense of wonder, and then trying to wrestle with the answers or wrestle
Mhm.
with what is there. And yeah, it's Heidegger. I think I don't. I would have loved to attended one of his lectures and seen, but I think good teachers want to do that. They want to make
Yeah.
something relatable, and they want to bring it into the lives of their students, and they're not trying to lord over their intelligence
Yeah.
and impress people. They're really, I think they discovered this richness, and now they want to share it and go like, oh yeah, it's really cool. I mean, I had a philosophy professor that took us outside onto the lawn of the campus, and we talked about what courage is, and people walked by, and it was so alive. It was such a weird thing for this old man to take these 20-year-olds out into like, this place and do this. But there was something about doing it in nature, and the
Hmm.
way he was talking with us, not at us or to us, that it really was like, oh, cool. It stayed with me for, 25 years in some way.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and it's even a representation or an example of what we talked about at the very beginning. It's two people meeting each other,
Yeah.
and at least one of their worlds being expanded.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
The
Yep.
horizons of intelligibility uh, became bigger, became more. And
Yep.
it's so weird that we can do that as a species, I
I
guess.
know. It's crazy. I mean, that's what happens in language. I find language such a shocking thing. Like, because we can talk with each other, it becomes possible for all these things to open up. Yeah, I find that truly
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah, it's a I do a dialectic course, and I've done a lot of group contemplative practices, and the the premise that not even just alone, but in dialogue together, we can discover new understanding of ourselves, each other, a topic or a third thing, with each other and with ourselves. It's such a
Yes.
it's this holistic kind of birthing of the self or something through uh, smaller things participating to create a bigger thing that then almost loves them back. It has this
Yeah,
weird, uh, yeah,
I think that's totally true. I mean, I rely on that idea when I try to organize. Excuse me, I try to organize various events, different times, various seminars,
yeah,
and that's
totally.
what I have always seen. I have always seen that when people get together sincerely, and actually want to do something together,
Yeah.
they they develop something through their interaction that's much bigger than they could ever bring on their own. Or it's even much bigger even than just the sum of all those individual things. Like a group does develop, and people through dialogue are taken to places neither one of them could ever have gone before. It is remarkable. And that's that. So those are the environments I try to produce when I can in teaching contexts. Ones where through talking, people will kind of collectively elevate themselves to a higher level of insight and thinking, and it happens all the time.
Yeah, so what are some conditions or principles that you employ or notice to do that? Because I think
Yeah.
that's uh like reverse engineering Socratic dialogue and the dialectical process of what used to be kind of normal in philosophy. Yeah,
I
what are
mean,
some ways to make that happen more often? Yeah.
in a group setting, I think the key really is beyond anything else. It's commitment. Like, the people have to have come there uh, wanting to interact well with each other and prepared to contribute and participate. So that's not how we approach most events. Typically, if you go, whatever it is, if you go to a concert or a class or whatever, you go there as your own individual self, and you go there already kind of deciding, like, I'm gonna select what I'm going to listen to and what I'm going to do, and you sort of hold yourself apart from people. And that's the thing that will keep a good interaction from happening. That's already shut too many doors. So I think that sessions work well when people come literally willing to participate. And so that means, like, sometimes we have groups where we're going to read something. Well, it means people should have prepared, like they should have read the thing, and they should come uh, expecting to talk. And that means uh, being prepared to give voice to some of their own ideas. It also means being prepared to shut up and listen to other people say their things. And then also, I guess this is the thing that where it really I mean, those things I said are all true. Like those are important preconditions. But then the place where it really happens is when you're talking. Why are you saying that thing? And the talking that works well is when, more like a normal conversation, the thing you say is actually meaningfully responsive to the thing the last person said.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's different from thinking, I've got my thing to say and I need to get it out there, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know, learning. So first of all, trying, and then through trying, learning how to do this, but
Uh-huh.
trying to make what you say be a meaningful response to what the other person said, as opposed to a show of ego or anything like that. Um, if people try to do that, the session will work better. And then the thing that really happens is when people try to do that, especially if you do this repeatedly, you learn how to do it better. You learn
Oh
how
yeah.
to listen better. You learn how
Uh,
to contribute better. You
yeah.
learn how to take the things that you have that you want to share, and instead of making them sort of ego driven things you shove in, you can see that those are actual resources that can help you to have, worthwhile things to
Yeah.
build with, and so, people learn how to be strong discussers, and that's actually what I most often see in sort of groups that I teaching kind of groups I work with. So that's the real evidence of people learning, is that they become much more powerful in conversation. And that
Yeah.
doesn't mean they become showy. It doesn't mean they become cool. It means what they learn how to do is listen to someone and respond constructively. And that's a powerful thing, and you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
learn. And that when that starts happening, like all kinds of other things happen too. But anyway, but those are the
Oh,
things.
that's not a but anyway. That was excellent. Yeah, because again, we do these practices and we give people roles, and I just dove into them. I was like, I think Theaetetus. I just fell in love with the idea of these contemplative practices, and I just jumped in and started doing them. And I quickly learned, like you said, the my goal when I'm like up next to speak is to be like engrossed in the other person and just
Yeah.
really giving them my attention and space. And if a thought comes up, I want to push it back and I want to reattend into them, at them, with them, and then bring that into me. And then, like you said, after that, I need to kind of not just intellectually do things, I need to like deeply open up and find something real in me that was connecting to that, and then bring that out into the group as well. And then again, I've seen this, I've done this, and I've trained people to do this even a little bit. You start to see them create a group flow state, and everyone
Exactly.
uh, takes on a life of its own, and everyone's feeling happiness and joy and light, and everything is moving. It's not clunky and self-absorbed, and yeah, and some of those times you go, oh, that conversation changed my life
Yeah,
somehow.
exactly. That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, I mean, and I feel like
Well,
I've seen that happen lots of times. That's a real thing, and you can learn to do it.
yeah, it seems like, I don't know, there's like a cynical, jaded part of us that doesn't believe that that's true. And it's right. You don't want to get hurt, I think, is a big part of
Mhm.
that, because I didn't say it earlier, but like a lot of what would give you these skills is like a vulnerability when you're with
Right.
others, instead of being guarded and yeah, having this identity that you're trying to protect. You're like, oh, what's real to me now? What's real to them? What's their body language telling me that their words aren't, or whatever, or their posture and things. And um yeah, and then like you said, there's something really empowering about starting to notice that power in yourself and to be a part of groups that are
Yeah.
doing that. It really just feels like a vitality.
Yeah, but I did want to say something about that, because of what you were saying about vulnerability. Like
Yeah, yeah, please.
it's in, and that is that this doesn't mean you should approach everybody you ever see and try to interact that way. Like this is a thing that has to happen between people, and so it also means the other people have to be doing that too.
Right.
And
Yeah, you can get
so
really hurt if you're the only one doing
yeah,
it.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
it really matters that um, these things are happening in the context of people who are all trying to do that. And so, those are contexts that presume honesty, commitment, and that sort of stuff. And so the reason I say that is sometimes you could think, oh, this is how I should always respond to any other person. And, requires a little more subtlety and discrimination than that.
Right.
There are some contexts where it's quite, sometimes you should keep up certain barriers because you're dealing with someone who's actually being very mean, or they are trying to get something.
Those relationships are so precious. I think that's why not only is it beautiful to experience those things, but you should fall in love with the people that do that with you, and you should really cherish that if you have that. You're absolutely
Yep.
Is there a second practice or dialogical mode that you teach young people that helps them in those, like when Socrates is down in the Piraeus, he can't quite say what he wants. Kant and Thrasymachus, like what's that second dance you need to learn?
Well, I think, I mean, that's a good point. I think, here I was talking about, just sort of straightforward responsiveness between people, but there is also a relationship of teaching and a relationship of learning. And so I think it's also important to recognize when there's someone from whom you need to learn something, as opposed to someone where what you have to say is going to be the equal of what they have to say.
Right. Yeah.
And the other way around too. Sometimes you have to recognize that you have a thing to say that is, and the other person's not the equal. And so that, that's what happens in teaching situations. So, there are lots of qualifications, but there are situations one really needs to come to with the idea that I'm here to learn. And that means you have to be prepared in those contexts to follow, right? And then there are other situations where you're in a situation to teach, and that means you have to be prepared to guide. So you were talking about a second thing. Well, that is a second thing. Before I was talking about the sort of strictly kind of a collaborative sort of co-building of something, which is very real. But there is another thing which is very real, which is that relationship of guiding and following. That's a thing that has to happen. And so, you're talking about things, to teach young people and so on. Well, this is very much a school thing. It's very important for one's development that one learns a certain kind of discipline in education, like learning how to actually sit down and read the book and try to pay attention accurately to what was said, and not just say, well, you said that, I'd like to say this other thing, but
right.
The skills of careful, precise discernment, careful, precise thinking, like that, the disciplined approach to the study of things is also a huge power, and something without which, if you don't have that developed at least to a reasonable degree, you're not going to do well in interactions in any context, because you won't really be able to listen, and you won't really be able to follow along with and contribute to the things that are said. So I think that notion of sort of collaborative back and forth is very powerful, but also the notion of disciplined apprenticeship or something like that. Being able to be led is crucial, and that's a thing to learn too. And then if you go through those things, you really also have to learn situations where it's your responsibility to lead and to be prepared to take on the demands of that situation and the responsibilities of it. So I would say those are also very, very real parts of human interaction and meaningful life. Parents and children would be another great place where that comes up. But you got to learn how to do them the right way. The fact that, if you go back to parents and children, the fact that it's my responsibility as a parent in many important ways to lead my son doesn't take away from the fact that in other respects, he's equal to me as a person.
Right.
I need to respect his equality all the time. It's very easy to slip into thinking that since I'm supposed to lead here, I'm also the boss.
Right.
That's not so good. So, it's the real moral and moral issues and issues of judgment here that have to do with figuring out which role to take when. That's not, that's demanding. But
Hmm.
but I guess my point just was there really are those different roles,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you got to learn how to handle them.
And those are important roles too, because I've taught for 15 years, and I remember like my first few years, I like to build rapport, and I worked with generally pretty good students. So if you have rapport, teaching goes pretty well.
Yep.
But sometimes something unexpected would happen, or I'd have a type of student that I didn't realize, or I just wasn't paying attention a certain way. And sometimes things wouldn't go the way I wanted. And I realized like it's my job to invite the quiet student in. It's my
Yep.
job to tell everyone to put their cell phones away, even though it might damage rapport.
Yep.
And sometimes like it's my job when the power goes out and the stoplight is just blinking red all four directions for me to go, okay, I'm going to go through and
Exactly.
it's safe for me to go through. And if I'm mindless about my role as a leader, then that can really cause unintended harm. And then the
Yep.
same thing, like you said, I think if I'm an individualist and I'm awesome and I'm an ego and I never learn how to submit and be a real student, and there's something really beautiful about mentorship and how
Hmm.
quickly you can learn from someone that's like devoted 40 years to an art, or 30 years to philosophy, and be their student for 4 months or two
Yep.
years or whatever it is, where you're actually getting like a download of learned knowledge into your soul if you do it right, and then you
Yep.
actually get to be that vessel for the next generation if you learn the craft and you love it and want to pass it on and stuff. So yeah, I think that would be really cool to see people take on the personal goal of how can I be a better leader, how can I be a better
Mhm.
follower, how can I be
Yeah.
a better friend to myself and to other people, and then those three kind of roles giving you a lot of tools to be an adult and to be
Exactly.
a good person. Yeah, that's
Yep.
cool, John. That's I think it's a good place to end because I don't want to take too much of your time, and I have a feeling I could talk to you for a long time. So
Well, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
yeah, would you be open to that? Would that be okay with
Yeah.
you?
Sure. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, great, John. Well, is there any other elements of the book you think we missed that you wanted to talk about, or anything else that maybe you wanted to
No,
add?
no, I mean, I really like your questions. I mean, because they come out of you sort of getting the point and having things to talk about, and they naturally lead into all kinds of issues. And I think different people are going to read it and get different things too. But I think the stuff you brought out is very powerful and very close to the issues that are on my mind. And I think uh, I think this is a pretty fair representation of the kind of stuff I'm trying to do. So I appreciate it.
Well, good, John. That means a lot to me to hear that, and that's really cool. Just the other question I wanted to ask is, what are some of the maybe ancient or Socratic or even medieval or modern philosophers that you like to talk about? So I was afraid to bring up questions
Well, that's
that
okay.
weren't in your really passion area. So yeah, what are some people you love to
Well,
me to
I mean, the thing I love the best, and also the thing that I think is the single best thing for people to read is Plato's Apology of Socrates. Socrates' defense speech. I think that's I, I've read lots and lots of books, but I really do think if I only had that book, that would probably give me enough. Like there's so much packed into it. Socrates is such an amazing character, and that's his speech in the Apology is so rich. So that's what I think anybody can read, because it doesn't matter. You don't have to have done anything to be able to get a lot out of it, and yet you can always go back to it and get more. And so that's the thing I most like to teach, and the thing that I probably most have thought about in my whole life.
Oh, cool.
But you mentioned lots of other people that I'm very interested in. I spent a lot of time studying Plotinus,
Oh,
a lot
really?
of time studying Proclus. They're sort of I wouldn't quite call it a closet passion, but there aren't that many places in the world where my interest in Plotinus and Proclus matters, but I'm very into them. Uh, Thomas Aquinas, I think, is pretty brilliant also. And then, most of my professional work, as I've done a lot of work on Plato and Aristotle, uh, but even more than that, I've mostly written about Kant and Hegel and Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, these people in the traditions of German idealism and sort of phenomenology. And all of these things are, any one of them. I mean, I would be happy teaching any one of them forever, and any person can study any of them. And then most recently, just in the last, I say recently, but it's still years and years and years. But
Sure.
but recently, I've become very, very interested in the Buddha. I'm less interested in the tradition of Buddhist thought than in the old Buddhist discourses, with the sort of with the stories of the Buddha and so on. And but I find Buddhism also remarkably insightful and powerful. And we know we're sort of talking a little bit about that here. But those are the main things. I think, Plato and Aristotle, Neoplatonism, German idealism, phenomenology, and Buddhism. I think that's that's my world.
That's awesome, man. I love all those things as well. I read Proclus all the time and Plotinus, and I'm really into Iamblichus right now. I'm learning about theurgy, and I'm just trying to wonder what are the limits of cognition and things like that. And so that's cool. Yeah, we'll definitely, if we do this again, explore some of them, because I would love to hear what you find passionate about them. But thank you so much for doing this, and I hope some people that listen to it get excited about your work. And you have a great YouTube channel where you can be passionate and share these ideas and things. So I will appreciate that and point all that in the description and stuff. So thank you so much. Yeah, anything else before we just personally?
No, that's great. Well, thank you for the invitation.
All right, John, have a great rest of your day, and take care.
Sure.
Bye.